Welcome to the latest in a series of IEAGHG webinars. My name is James Craig and I work as Senior Geologist here with IEAGHG in Cheltenham, UK. And today we have a webinar on CO2 Data Share, which is a US-Norwegian initiative to share data on CO2 storage. For those of you not familiar with IEAGHG, it's formerly known as the IEA Greenhouse Gas R&D Program. It was founded in 1991 and is a IEA technology collaboration program supported by 32 members, a mix of governments, industry and research organizations. We are set up to offer strategic direction and we run a technical program. We don't define policies, but we do supply technical information in support of policy. What we do, we cover assess mitigation options with our focus very strongly on R&D, track capture development costs, monitor geological storage performance, and provide our members with policy and independent technical input. As you can see, we have a broad spread of country support, and notably today, United States and Norway. So today, Greta Tanger from SINTEF and Odd Anderson from SINTEF will give a background to the data share and how it will work, and then we will then switch to Philip Ringrose from Equinor, who will facilitate a discussion on how the data share will operate, and there will be time for questions at the end. Our first speaker is Greta Tanger from SINTEF. She has a very strong background in technical support and has a PhD from the Department of Norway, University of Science and Technology. She has a long-standing experience from management and international work and has a lot of experience running multidisciplinary projects, particularly in oil and gas production and CO2 storage. Significantly, she's also the project manager of CO2 Data Share.
Thank you, James. Then I will try to share my presentation. Let me see. We'll put it in presentation mode and hope that you will see it. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Great. Yes. Thank you, James, and thank you for this nice introduction. And we are very grateful that IEAGHG is hosting this webinar. And before we dive into the aspects related to the technical solution, I would like to give just a brief presentation of the background and the motivation for this new project, and also show the timeline for the work. And as some of you already may know, the idea emerged between US and Norwegian researchers already in 2015 related to this project. It was realized that sharing reference datasets from pioneering CO2 storage projects would be very useful to accelerate improved understanding, to build capacity, reduce the cost, and minimize the uncertainties associated with CO2 storage in geological formations. Also, it was seen that a platform for sharing data will underpin the CSLF large-scale saline storage project network. So by the support from Gassnova and also the CLIMIT program, the CO2 Storage Data Consortium was established and came into operation in 2016 with a steering committee and a secretariat. And we also organized a launch event during GHGT 13 in Lausanne, where many of you participated. And we saw that many in the CCS community welcomed this initiative. So after this event in 2016, we have been working to establish a project with combined funding from Norway and US to start this project.
Greta, can I just interrupt you for 1 second?
Yes.
Could you
do
the full screen, because we're seeing like not the full slideshow screen. I don't know if you're able to.
Okay, maybe I have to switch this display settings.
We're getting a query come through saying that they.
That's better.
Is that better?
That's right.
I just have to move this one. Okay.
Thank you.
Then you can see it.
Yeah.
Good, good that you said it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, and then I will go to the next slide, hopefully. Yes. Just to say a little bit about this project, because in 2017, this new project, CO2 Data Share, was granted funding from the CLIMIT demo program in Norway, administered by Gassnova, and also the US Department of Energy through the University of Illinois. And the objective of this project is to build a digital platform for sharing reference datasets from pioneering CO2 storage projects. And this project is formally starting now in May 2018, and we are aiming to share the first datasets in the first part of 2019. And then the project will run until the end of 2020. And the project aims to develop an infrastructure for sharing data, but also community activities that can contribute to lowering the threshold for data owners to share data, and also to stimulate the exchange of high quality and well-curated CO2 storage data. And the motivation is that easy access to properly prepared and well-documented datasets presented in standard formats can accelerate the new development of, for instance, site characterization methods, reservoir simulation techniques, and monitoring technologies. And we see that wide use of common datasets is useful for comparing similar methods. It encourages complementarity of research and also stimulates the international collaboration. The availability of common datasets also enables the practice of reproducible research, so that anyone sufficiently qualified is able to verify or further build on previously published results. And I think that the Sleipner CO2 storage project is a great example illustrating the value of data sharing, where selected monitoring and modeling datasets have been shared over many, many years with many research institutes globally. And the result is thousands of publications to this date related to this data. So what data will be shared in this consortium? The first datasets proposed to be shared will focus on existing projects where available site data has already been used for advancing the knowledge and technology development. And two examples are in this slide, the well-known Sleipner CO2 storage project and also the Illinois Basin Decatur project. But in addition to this, we hope to share also data gathered in as part of emerging storage projects. And a very relevant case is the planned Norwegian full-scale CCS project. As many of you may know, the Norwegian government has now decided to actually continue the work towards a possible investment decision for a full-scale project in Norway. And this will imply continued work on characterizing the formation, and that is considered most suitable for CO2 storage, and also more data that will become available. But an important perspective in this is that CO2 data share will not be a huge repository for all kinds of data, but it's made for selected high quality data sets prepared to assist researchers in addressing key uncertainties and challenges related to CO2 storage. But Still, we hope to promote sharing of various kinds of data, datasets on site geology, well data, geophysical monitoring, and reservoir data and models, and from various sources, commercial, academic, and public institutions. So as you can see, there will be a large variety of datasets suitable for different purposes and many stakeholders. And this means that we really need a sound strategy for data management that can enable simple archive processes, adequate support for data providers and users, and long-term maintenance of the archive. After the launch event at GHDT, we conducted a survey to get a better understanding of what the stakeholders would need from such a platform. And 50 participants in this survey, mainly data users, about 13% data providers. It was interesting to see that in addition to the top 5 data sets considered most relevant for sharing, there was a long list of other data sets that was wanted by the users. And also some asked for raw data, not only the process data. And when it came to willingness of sharing data, it was a bit mixed response. Some data owners expressed interest in sharing and even suggested data sets to share, but some also expressed the need for more information and agreements related to access terms and protection of data owners' interests. And the survey also raised some relevant questions from the data provider's point of view, particularly regarding resources needed to prepare and transfer data sets, need of updating data, control of proper use according to technical and scientific standards. So this was important points highlighted by the participants. Another important message from the survey is that very few respondents indicated some willingness to pay for participation or access to datasets, which confirmed that we need to establish a solution for long-term funding for the operation and maintenance of a platform. And finally, the survey also provided a variety of inputs and recommendations regarding the management of the consortium and technical solutions. And in particular, the survey and also the discussions at GHDT underlined the importance of careful selection of metadata. And this is in line with other surveys documenting that a main obstacle to data sharing seems to be the ability to actually organize the data in useful ways. Okay, so at present, CO2 Data Share includes representatives from Norway and the US and UK. And we see that to maximize the utilization of the data, the ambition is to be an open network and expand with new participants in more countries. And over the last 2 years, the initiative has received positive interest from many countries and also organizations like the CSLF. So CO2 Data Share will actively work to broaden this partnership. What our survey also confirmed that we need to have actions to ensure the long-term commitment from private and public sponsors to be able to fund the operation of the platform, because user funding is not a realistic or a robust solution. So therefore, we will have to work continuously to build a consortium with new sponsors to secure the funding and enable the operation beyond the 3 years that we have the project now. The good thing is that we now have a contractual framework that can make it such expansion efficient. But to make it happen, we will have to work with data users and sponsors, and we welcome any initiative to start a dialogue, and there will be contact information in this presentation, and also it's possible to contact us directly to discuss that. Finally, before we go into the technical part of this webinar, just a quick look at the project milestones. Today we have kind of a kickoff of the project, this webinar. It's a formal starting point for the work of the project. And then we plan to have a user specification ready early fall and organize a new webinar to discuss the user specification and have feedback. Also, there will be opportunities for discussion during GHDT Melbourne, and we plan to have a technical specification in November and launch the first datasets the first part of 2019. And then also we plan to have webinars related to specific datasets when they become available. So as you can see, we plan to have an interactive dialogue, both in the development of the platform and also in the operation of this platform. Yeah. And then I think I will give the microphone to Odd. Let me see. I'll just see if I can do that. Yes.
Okay. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, I can see it at least.
Okay. So then I will talk a little bit about the actual technical solution that we have been thinking of. And before starting this, I think it's good to remind that the project is just starting up. So any discussion of technical solution will have to remain fairly generic, but I will present what we have foreseen and how we want this solution to be. Let's see if I can switch this slide here. Yes. So in practice, what we are thinking of is an online data portal where you can go to find, discover, and download datasets. And I'll talk a little bit about how this portal will work. And to do that, I will start with the way data comes into the portal. So how a data provider can contribute. So the intention of this slide is to show that the data provider will be in dialogue with the CO2 Data Storage Consortium in order to select and prepare the data set in question. So as Grete mentioned before, the purpose or the idea with this this portal is that the datasets should not be just any datasets that could be uploaded without much oversight, but we are aiming for a catalog of curated datasets that have been, where there have been effort laid down into presenting them well, and whose quality is ensured to be relevant for a larger audience. So rather than a list of datasets, we imagine a kind of catalog with separate landing pages for each dataset, where you find a detailed description and so on. So the first step, of course, when you prepare the dataset here, is that we will collaborate with the data provider. We will develop, fill in the necessary metadata, a description, assign a document, a digital object identifier, and sort out the terms of use. So when everything is ready, we have then defined the reference dataset. And by the way, by dataset here, we mean a collection of related information. So not necessarily one file, but a package of files that are related. And so then we will publish it on the CO2 Data Store web portal. The users can then go to the site, they can browse, they can search, and they can read about the content. The actual datasets might be stored on the site, on the main hosting service, alongside with the metadata database. But depending on the wishes also of the original data provider, the data provider might prefer that they store the data themselves, in which case the portal will provide a transparent solution for users to get the data downloaded from the provider. So these are just two different ways of storing the data. Also, we should mention that we hope, or our aim is to have data as openly available as possible, but we are also aware that that there are licensing and rights, terms of rights issues, so that the the data provider will have to decide how data should be shared. And it could be that the user can just download it, that he or she will have to register or be part of a specific group, or that data has to be granted on a case-by-case basis. But in any case, the information about the data will be browsable and available on the portal. So what do we mean by data sets and that go into the portal? There is no formal definition, and in any case, there will be a kind of screening procedure and a dialogue with the data provider. But you can think of data in this case as high-quality project data that can advance knowledge and technology development, essential for operating and monitoring CO2 storage sites. So the scope is fairly wide when it comes to storage data. We will start with some initial data sets. Grete briefly mentioned that a moment ago. So these initial data sets will be kind of worked on during the establishment of this data portal. There are injection well data sets from Sleipner and from the Catcher project. CO2 flow modeling datasets from Sleipner, and also geomechanical response datasets from the INSALA project. But also, as Grete mentioned, there are interest in other sorts of datasets. So this will have to grow as we go along, and we identify the datasets that can be interested to publish. Let's see. Then a very important point here is the metadata. So the metadata is important both in order for searching and for visibility online, but also for properly documenting and browsing the data, and ensure that there is no misunderstanding when it comes to, for instance, how the data has been generated, what the sources are, assumptions, and basically how the data could be reasonably used. So the idea is to develop a way to ensure that this is that these criteria are met. I think that it will likely be based on some existing standard for metadata and probably expanded with the needs of the project. But we will have to see about that, and we will have to learn from other data sharing initiatives, as I will touch in a little later. But basically, the concerns here is that we want to avoid unduly burden on the data providers, but on the other hand, avoid misunderstandings and misuse of data. So this is a balance when it comes to how much and the detail of data that we want to have here. A little bit about the technical solution of the portal itself. That is also something that is very early phase. So I think we could at least mention the criteria and the concerns we have when deciding on the solution. We are concerned about the long time storage and secure storage, and also that you have a sufficient capacity for a reasonable cost. Data visibility, that's also about referencing options and metadata. And we also want to be able to design our website the way we want and to include the features that we want on this site. And there needs to be a way to manage the access, since there are some datasets that are where there need to be special conditions or licenses attached to the data. So when you look out to various options that exist out there, there are some data sharing solutions that are out there. For instance, there are these free research data repositories like Zenodo, where you basically use this external site, and you create a user and a group, and you can use that to post data. So this is a very simple and low-cost solution, but it's also low in flexibility on how you can set up and design your data presentation and your data site. On the other hand, you can go for a very full freedom solution, so to speak, where you manage everything yourself. You design the software, you have a commercial data host and web portal provider. But there are also the issues about that was just mentioned on the previous slide when it comes to longevity, security, and so on, that are where you will need to assume quite much more significant responsibilities when you are doing everything yourself. So we have also considered some in-between options where we use existing infrastructure that provides some flexibility to customize the solution. And we have been in contact with a Norwegian provider, or basically the Norwegian provider for e-infrastructure for the university sector. They are called Sigma 2. We had some initial discussion with them last year when we were applying for this project, and found out that they were quite, from the dialogue with them, we had the impression that they have, we learned that they are able to cover most of our needs. They provide long-term storage, also of sensitive data, and they have some ways to offer customized solutions. So we have now just picking up the thread again with them, and going to discuss more in detail now that the project has actually been granted. So yeah, again, they are subsidized by the Norwegian government, so they have a very competitive pricing schemes compared to other commercial options. And they have things like versioning and citable databases and so on. So that's the primary option that we consider at the moment. As for the software solution, we are thinking of basing it on the existing open source software CCAN for sharing of data. It's an open source tool for making open data sites, and developed by some organization called Open Knowledge International. It's developed in Python using these frameworks Pylon and Flask. It started out in Python, so I think they're gradually migrating to Flask with a front end in JavaScript. We have looked into this software, and it is a very modular and customizable work, and with a API to add third-party applications and plugins. And it is used by a lot of different organizations, including many government organizations, and like you can see here, the UK government data, public US government information, the Department of Energy and NETL Energy Data Exchange, and the EU Open Data. So these are used by many different entities, and they have all customized them and changed the software according to their needs. So in the work going forward, we are going to write a user specification and a technical specification. We want to learn as much as we can from other initiatives that are similar in some way. I have listed a few here. And I think that a point to make here is that we want to complement, but we do not intend to replace, of course, national CCS project databases. Our scope is really to select a few very highly relevant and well-documented datasets to present to the general community. But we believe that we have a lot of to learn from these other initiatives, especially when it comes to the documentation of data and procedures and so on. Yes, so just a couple of more words about the specification documents that we are working on. There is planned user specification end of August 2019, in which we will clarify the scope of the metadata and the data types, and provide a kind of high-level description of the functionality, what should be included and how it should work for the web portal, and also procedures on how to prepare and contribute data. This specification will be followed by a technical specification towards the end of the year, which will be a more detailed explanation of the metadata, a detailed document presenting the intended web portal design and functionality, and describing the software involved. And also by then we will have settled the agreements with the infrastructure providers and whether we need software development services. So this is the plan going forward, and I think we can just mention again that we really are looking for input in all parts of this process to learn about users, what they are interested in terms of features and functionality, the concerns of data providers and how we can meet those, and also what we can learn from other initiatives. So I think that is the end of my talk on the technical solution, and I will leave the word again to the next speaker for the questions and comment section. So thank you.
Thank you, Odd. It's Philip Ringrose here. James, did you want to say a word, or shall I roll ahead?
No, you carry on, Philip.
Okay, very good. So, so the next 20 minutes or so is a chance for people on the call to maybe field a few questions. James, if you've written them on the Q&A, James will try and feed them through. I'll just say a few introductory words and take it from there. But I represent, if you like, an example data provider. And so we have a lot of experience of the do's and don'ts with sharing data. I would say the huge benefit is that when you share data, you leverage the competences of the worldwide community, researchers, technicians, practitioners. So there's enormous benefit in sharing data, but there's also a cost, because typically when you share a data set, you get 1,000 questions by people who do not fully understand the format of the data, the intention of the data, the assumptions. So I think one of our motivations is to have a portal which really facilitates the sharing and has high quality control, and that's why we focused on reference data sets. And as Greta and Odd have mentioned, we've got a couple of data sets that are already available. So it's not like we're waiting for data sets, but we will start with our currently available data sets, and then we'll build from there. And we're very open to other offers of data sets worldwide. So yeah, any questions or comments fielded?
Well, Philip, you mentioned the potential for other demonstration sites, for example. I mean, presumably they could approach you with a data set that's maybe linked. How would that be managed?
So I think if say site X comes to us and says, hey, we've got some data, can we share it, or we are interested in sharing it, I think our first question would be, which part of the data do you think would be most useful for learning in the international community? So then we would try and pinpoint the part of that data that would be most valuable. So say a site has some really good downhole pressure and temperature data, and it's been useful in calibrating, you know, models or monitoring data. We say, okay, can you get a selection of that pressure and temperature data set and show us how it's been interpreted and show us the challenges that exist in improving the interpretation. So then the discussion would end up with, okay, here is a downhole pressure data set. Or another discussion might be, we have a very good geological database with seismic and wells, but not much dynamic data. But we think that the geological data set could be useful for people wanting to do simulations of CO2 storage in a speculative way. So that's the kind of dialogue we'd expect to have with data users. Try and identify what aspects of your data could be useful to the research community globally, and what would be the objectives of learning from that.
No. So we've got another question coming in, Philip, just asking about how to attract other parties to participate in this project.
I imagine that question is related again to parties with data sets, because what we found in the survey is that most people interested are users, and there's a relatively small number of data providers that are interested, but there are several of them. And a lot of data providers are concerned about rights, access, abuse of data. So I think with potential data providers who are concerned, what we would try and do is assure them two things: that we would only be sharing a limited part of their data that's useful, and that in our dialogue with them and developing the meta information, the metadata describing it, we would protect the data user from, you know, claims of, you know, that were in error. So you know, I think that there's basically a kind of screening process to assure the data provider that the data will be used in an intelligent way. We expect there maybe will be some genuinely public data sets, like data that's already published in the scientific literature, and just a matter of packaging it nicely. And other data sets will require users to sign a non-disclosure agreement before they access the data. So there may be conditions to certain data sets saying that you know, accept some terms and conditions. And I think when we explain those processes to data providers, hopefully they will start volunteering their data sets. That's my hope anyway.
And is there the potential from that where there could be, well, obviously discussion at conferences and meetings and so forth, but some sort of mutual discussion forum between somebody who's donated, say, for a better term, data from a project X, and then compared it, say, with other similar situations elsewhere? I mean, in the longer term, is that a possibility?
It is. For example, very successful data sets might become the subject of an international conference workshop where dozens of researchers compare their latest techniques on analyzing the same data set. And that has enormous benefits. We've had benchmark models in other fields of science, including subsurface science, and so some of these models may become benchmarks, so that people developing software to do particular analysis, for example, multi-phase flow equations, which I'm familiar with, you know, the finite difference, finite element models are evolving all the time, and modelers might want to refer their algorithms to a reference data set. And that's a classic example of how sharing a data set can bring added value and be used in international forums.
Yeah, that sounds really powerful. We have another question. Which European countries will be involved in the project?
Yeah, well, you know, it's very open, and the reason why USA and Norway have kicked this off is partly because those countries have data sets and projects that are fairly mature, and and other countries, for example, have demonstration and test sites. So if you think about Europe, France, Netherlands, and the UK all have test demonstration projects. So they would be natural candidates to volunteer or share their data sets. So there's no limits in that sense, and really we're looking for engagement with projects to say, I think my project data set might be useful to the international community. Can we start discussing it with you?
Another question, I think this is more on the sort of practicality. Can you elaborate on the access of the data and its usage?
Well, it might be a question for Odd, that, but I mean, if I paraphrase what Odd was saying, is that the user will go into a web portal, will learn about the data sets, and the metadata will explain what the data set is. And then when they actually want to access the digital data, which can be large volumes, megabytes, gigabytes, potentially more, they will have to either sign an agreement to access the digital data, or follow a link to the location where that high quality digital data is stored, and go from there. And for example, seismic data set, the CLIMIT project has made available some seismic data sets to the international community, but to use them, you have to understand the format of seismic data. There are dozens of different formats, and you need to have the competence to understand seismic data to use the data.
Okay, another question on a similar sort of vein. How will you deal with the transfer, ingestion and distribution of large file sizes? And I think the questioner here is thinking about seismic, gigabyte type scale.
Yeah, it's a really hard question to answer. I mean, I think seismic data sets go from terabytes upwards. Our intention is to start small and work up. So the seismic cube only covers a relatively small area, a couple of square kilometer area and half a kilometer of depth. So it's less than a terabyte. But it's still large. And so, for example, conventionally you'd have to go to an FTP server to download it, and I would have to ask the techie geeks, how we would actually come up with a solution. But some of the large platforms that exist, like the one that Odd mentioned, they are used to handling terabytes of data. Isn't that correct, Odd?
That's right. The Sigma 2, which I talked about, they are handling very large amounts of data from various research projects, and they have the necessary infrastructure to handle that, as far as I understand.
So we're not starting from scratch. We're starting from platforms that have experience with this data handling issue.
There is also the possibility, as I also mentioned before, that certain data providers prefer to host or to keep the data on their own system. So that is also a possibility, whether that means that they will allow downloads or that they will provide data in forms of by other means.
It's like the television.
Yeah, there is a comment here that most online networks do not handle upload or download of these resources at this time. Well, that's maybe now, but maybe things might be different in the future. Any comments on
that is exactly the point of what we're trying to achieve, because at the moment, if you want to download these very large data sets, you have to contact the data owner directly and go into a long discussion about access. But if you look into the space industry or into bio industry, there are other areas of science that are used to handling large data sets. So, what we're trying to do is to create a platform that's appropriate for small and large data sets related to CO2 storage to facilitate that. And we're not starting from zero. We're going to learn from science data sharing networks that exist already.
Yeah. and of course, it's always better to start with something you're familiar with, test the system, make sure it works, and see what functions properly before then advancing to something else. So, do you have any other thoughts about the forward program in terms of? I noticed there was a discussion about another webinar in September. So what will be happening between now and then, and what might we expect to see in September?
Yeah, I think more technical specifications, as Odd and Greta were explaining. But in a way, it's round 2, and by then we'll be able to give more specific information. And I also hope that by that time we've had more contact with users and data providers by email or whatever to make suggestions and proposals that we can start handling. Odd, do you want to add any more? What would we try and achieve by the next webinar?
I think you were very clear. We are working, as mentioned, on this user specification and the technical specification. And we are building on the work that was done in the pre-project, but there are still very many choices to be made, and we need to reach agreements with hosting and do a thorough assessment of the software options and so on, and hopefully get good feedback from potential providers and users that we can integrate in the process. So that's how we see the work going on.
Good.
I might add also that in the process of developing this user specification and technical specification, we hope to use existing data sets to test and to make simple pilots to use the data sets actively in the development process. So that is also another reason for getting in touch with more data providers that could be part of this.
Thank you, Greta. One final question here. Are you going to collect all the relevant publications associated with data sets?
I think I would say that that's too big a deal, but the publications that we would be citing or including in our metadata would be if a publication includes a reference data set, and I can think of a dozen of those already existing, then we might just say, if you're interested in this particular reference data set published by Smith et al. In 1992, here's the paper and here is the data in digital form so that it's easy to use. So I think my answer would be we would only cite papers that include useful data sets. Yeah. We couldn't hope to cite all the papers that have used the data sets.
Yes, indeed. What we will be doing is to, if we get further questions, we'll be collating them and forwarding them on to you so that you can answer them at a later date. I think this has been a very useful and it sounds like a very exciting project, particularly as CO2 storage is potentially getting into quite an expansive and exciting stage. So I think this will help a great deal. I would like to thank Greta, Odd and Philip for their input today. I think we've had a very clear presentation, and we will look forward to circulating and presenting this webinar on YouTube in the next few days. And indeed, please look out for further webinars in relation to this CO2 data share. And with that, we'll say goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.